Thank you, Heather. Thank you. So I'd like to start with a quote from Jimmy Carter. I think the main thing is to set a goal for all of us that every human being ought to have a decent place to live. I think it's one of the basic human rights, just like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So that's definitely a world that I want to live in, one where there's sufficient housing for all abilities, all ages, enough housing so that each individual may choose the terms and conditions of which they want to engage the world. In my presentation today, I'm going to give you some hard facts of why we're not quite there yet. I'm going to talk about the state of affairs in housing, and I'm going to share with you some of the ways that faith communities can help to improve things. Matthew Desmond is a social scientist who studied the impact of eviction in perpetuating racism and economic inequality. And he recently asked, do we believe housing is a right and that affordable housing is part of what it should mean to be American? It's hard to argue that housing is not a fundamental need. The reason is simple, because without stable shelter, everything falls apart. And to be blunt, in housing, we are falling apart. As a country, and as a state, and as a city. A January report from the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty said that U.S. promises made in 1948, 1949, and 1996 to progressively house all of the citizens have been badly broken. An investigator this past January from the United Nations Commission on Human Rights cited the United States for a range of violations and a dire reality of human rights denial in the area of housing. So what's the problem? Well, it's housing affordability and housing availability. The federal government's role has shrunk, and a lot of the responsibility has fallen to the state and local governments. Existing rental units that are affordable to low-income housing are being lost to redevelopment, gentrification, and deterioration. The Joint Center for Housing Studies estimated that there's a net loss of over 100,000 low-cost units every year. These units are being replaced, but the replacement units that enter the market are usually with very high rents. The National Alliance of HUD Tenants estimates that since 1996, 200,000 subsidized units were converted. The supply of affordable low-cost units is exacerbated by federal subsidies and contracts. They estimate that several million government-assisted housing units will convert to market rate housing or to condominiums or non-residential use by 2020. And the problem with that is one of the ways that they have been building affordable housing in this country is through the low-income housing tax credit. 1/3 of all affordable housing has been produced that way. When that first came to pass in 1986, you could take advantage of that tax credit, and then after 15 years, it could convert to market rate. You had to keep it low income, and then it could convert to market rate. They went ahead and changed that in the 90s to you have to have it low income for 30 years. So what that means is when we get to 2020, a lot of our affordable housing stock is going to be at the mercy of the owners. Are they going to keep it low income housing or are they not? And of course, when low income housing is replaced with more expensive housing, the housing cost burden for a person living there is excessive and sometimes drives them out of their home. When you look at people who rely on SSI, for them, an affordable housing unit, something affordable within their income, would need to be $169 a month. And that's the corrupt United States. Can you imagine finding anywhere you could live even with multiple roommates in Eugene, for $169 a month. And housing affordability and stability has been a long-standing issue in Eugene. Almost 2/3 of our housing stock was built prior to 1980. We've had a lot of new construction, but it's not affordable to moderate or low-income households. And the growth in the number of newcomers that make a lot of money is preventing the high-income stock from filtering down, that trickle down that people seem to think happens. I haven't seen it. In Lane County, 42% of all households currently live in unaffordable housing. The current affordable housing deficit, 24,000 units. That means there are 24,000 households who are trying to get by in housing that is not sustainable for them, and they have to make hard choices on how they're going to spend their remaining funds. And these households are close to or below the median income, and they're most in danger for the rising rates. These are people like recently hired teachers, police officers, firefighters, nurses, people who work in nonprofits. Those people have to have 2 incomes and at least 10 years of job experience in order to be able to afford housing. Based on paired testing and complaint data, in our community, members of protected classes experience greater difficulty in finding and retaining stable housing. Those are people with, could be race, national origin, gender conforming status, familial status, disability, all those different characteristics of a household greatly influence whether or not someone has housing. Renter concerns have emerged in the past 10 years about deposits, notifications, rent increases, lease terminations, and no-cause evictions. Low credit scores, eviction records, or prohibitive application fees are huge barriers to people, especially low-income people and people of color. In 2016, there were 1,300 evictions in Eugene Springfield. So homelessness continues to rise. In Lane County, last year, 15,000 people reported being homeless at least one time. I don't know why that's not the number that people usually think of. They usually think of the point in time count, which is closer to 1,500 people. That's the people who are unsheltered, who just had nowhere else to go. And our current shelter capacity for emergency shelter is around 500. So we know we're woefully under-sheltered in addition to not having the housing we need. Pope Francis, speaking to Catholic Charities in Washington, D.C., when he visited the USA in 2015, said, "We can find no social or moral justification, no justification whatsoever for lack of housing." Mainstream policy discussion on the question of housing affordability and stability is shaped by the idea that the market should provide housing and that any intervention should interfere as little as possible with the ability of owners and investors to profit from the ownership of land and housing. Communities of faith have an opportunity to step in and help to build housing communities instead of housing commodities. We can find the social and moral justification for the work. Housing should be a human right. So how do we address this huge task? And it's huge. Affordable housing alone, there's so many activities that need to happen. You need to find somebody to find land, advocates to set the process in motion, developers to acquire it, architects to design it, banks to finance it, local governments to approve the plan, businesses to sell the materials, construction workers to do the building, building inspectors to monitor the construction, agents to sell the home, and buyers to buy them. To understate the case, the creation of actual affordable housing units takes more than the efforts of a single citizen or a group of concerned citizens. It requires highly skilled coordination among many people with varied ideological interests. And creating shelter requires no less effort. In addition to all those things, you also need to find providers to connect with and contract with, a lot of fundraising, consensus to build with neighbors, vetting processes to implement, and volunteers to train and recruit. The task for you is to select those actions that are most appropriate for your own community setting, for your group, and for you personally. Churches, synagogues, and temples usually start with some strong advantages. You're already nonprofit, and you have credibility within the community. So you're well poised to do a number of things. First one, be involved with the affordable housing opportunities for your parishioners and the larger community. Here, I went around and I looked at all the handouts and brochures. This is a great congregation for really getting outreach out to people. But I didn't see some of the tools that you could also have here. The City of Eugene has a number of repair and rehabilitation programs for homes and other programs. So you could go to the City of Eugene and get all kinds of information that you could have available. Attend advocacy trainings. Cornerstone has at least 2 a year. They're a nonprofit affordable housing developer here in town. Influence local government to increase grants and loans for affordable housing construction. Your voice is so important, and when you raise it together, you really let the counselors and legislators know that this is an important issue. Work to change zoning regulations to facilitate construction. One of the things that you hear about in Eugene is people don't like density. Well, we're going to have to get denser if we're going to be able to solve this problem. It's just cheaper per unit to go up. And I think that what I've experienced is neighborhoods are often angrier about the height of a building than anything else. It's just the way it is. And then support the creation of group homes. A lot of times group homes necessitate the need for a public notice. And whenever there's public notice given, there's always going to be a group of people who come out usually against it. And the only way to counter that is to have people who are for it and can speak eloquently to the need for it. Encourage your parishioners to know their rights, such as protection from unlawful rent increases, threats, pressures, or eviction. The City of Eugene has fair housing training, and you could have that brought into your congregation. You could also work with them to get fair housing brochures and information so people know what their rights are. Provide educational sessions on housing and homelessness related issues, or support community partners to do the same. One of the things that's happening right now is we're going to be doing when I say we, the Eugene Human Rights Commission Homelessness Working Group is putting on a 6-film series. The film is Under the Bridge, Criminalization of Homelessness. And it's a movie about one summer in Indianapolis. And it was a community very much like ours, where there's just totally insufficient shelter. And what the people who were living under the bridge had to go through in order to just maintain their basic living. This is a particularly important movie now because just on Tuesday, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that you can not penalize someone for sitting, sleeping, or lying down. And that's a big deal because a lot of people have lived their life in fear of getting caught sleeping somewhere. And I'm not sure how this will shake down in public policy long term, but if you see, how many of you have been to California and seen how the tent cities have formed over the past few years? They do not enforce the camping ban in their communities, and partly because cities have to make a choice. Is it going to be cheaper to defend themselves in a lawsuit for penalizing someone, or will it be cheaper to comply with the new ruling? So California, I think, expects they will get sued, and that's not a good option for them. How Oregon will respond, I'm not sure. But this movie, come see me afterwards, and I'll give you the times. I'll make sure that our flyer about that movie goes out in your email. If you could promote that within your congregations, pick a day where multiple people can come. They're in the community centers, and it would give you a great chance to talk to people afterwards. The other thing you can do is have tours of community-supported shelters or the mission. Those are other ways to get your parishioners involved. And then advocate for affordable housing strategies, local rent control, and other protective legislation. The state of Oregon has enabled 2 new tools for local jurisdictions to be able to use. And one, Cindy spoke to earlier, the construction excise tax. What that is it allows for cities to create a local affordable housing trust fund through the implementation of taxing new construction, up to 1%. And they've done that in a lot of jurisdictions, but they have not yet implemented that in our community. The other tool that the legislative session passed was inclusionary zoning. What that is it asks that all new housing includes at least 20%, no, not 20%, 20 or more units in their in the new building that are affordable. And the question of affordability is right, because maybe it's affordable, but is the transportation affordable? All the other costs, burdens that a human has, maybe it's not as affordable as all that. And then another housing-related bill that was passed was the accessory dwelling unit, to try to make it easier for people to build little houses in their backyard and now that's been pretty well embraced in Springfield and in Portland. We haven't seen a huge increase in housing from it, but it provides some new opportunities that we hadn't had before. Here in Eugene, it's kind of a hot topic because one of the reasons why it can be hard to build a house is you have to have sufficient parking, and adding that parking space can be expensive in the cost of adding an ADU. Also, the recommendation is to remove the owner occupancy requirement. So right now, you have to own your house, and then you can rent out the second house on the lot. And that's a great, that's not a very common situation. A lot of times, you might want to have, if someone's going to be buying a unit for rental, they may not live on site. So waiving the parking requirement and waiving the ability for a person to have to live on site are 2 things that they're going to have to decide. And the city of Eugene has heard from the Housing Policy Board on this issue. The Housing Policy Board is an intergovernmental agency that advises legislators on what to do to retain and increase affordable housing. And they keep saying, pass the tax, put inclusionary zoning, let's do this. But they keep, you know how we are in Eugene, it just, well, let's get more stakeholders involved. We need more voices. We need more voices to the table. So that's kind of where we are right now with these tools. They've decided to create a housing strategies group in which they've invited about 65 different people to participate. And they're going to talk about the housing strategies as a package. I think they think it'll be easier to roll out a bundle of housing strategies than one at a time. So they have a consultant coming in, and they're going to have 4 meetings. I haven't seen the list of who's represented, but I would be surprised if the people in this room are on that list. And I think that it's a mistake not to include churches as stakeholders, because churches are providing shelter. Churches are providing housing. I mean, when there's not enough, churches step up. So today at 12 o'clock in the atrium building, they're going to have an update on the Housing Policy Board on this housing strategies toolkit. I encourage any of you, all of you, to go to that public forum right before there and be in that room and say, are our voices being heard? But listen to what they have to say about the housing strategies meeting, and you'll really get an idea for where we're going with that. Third floor, the Sol room, that's right. And then, of course, work with your neighborhood association to help expand shelter and housing in your neighborhood. You know your area better than anybody else. So if you see a spot that looks like it could be shelter, it could be affordable housing, say something. Because they don't know in the city. They're looking at maps and computers. They may not know the right things. And if you don't have a neighborhood association, the Human Rights and Neighborhood Involvement Office can work with you on that. We have a group through the Neighborhood Leadership Council that meets on the fourth Thursday of every month to help support any efforts people have. And then last, consider joining with other churches in your community to form an interfaith housing partnership. In Boston, they had 87 religious groups that started a petition, and their goal was to get 100,000 signatures to convince their legislator to create a $65 million housing trust fund. While the outcome is unknown, it was a really unprecedented kind of group effort, and it made a lot of difference. And then, of course, offering shelter if you can. You know all the different options that are available. There's also another one. If you have a parishioner who has a spare bedroom in their house and wants to get involved, a Family for Every Child has unaccompanied youth that need a place to be, and they can get involved with becoming a host home for a child who really needs it. So with that, I'd like to open up for questions, and then we're going to have some small group discussion.